And last but not least, let's talk about poverty in the U.S. First point, women are more likely to be poor than men. This is called a feminization of poverty. Now, why is that? Well, for a number of reasons. One, women earn less money than men, even for similar work. Secondly, if there's a marriage and a divorce, oftentimes women take custody of the kids. So she's spending most of her money on the children and the needs of the children. She has less income. Divorce can plummet a woman into poverty faster than anything, especially if she doesn't work and she depends on her husband for income. If she's a single mom and never married, and she's earning less money anyway, then she's going to have some economic challenges. Now, the second point on your slide. Some people blame the poor for their poverty. And we can thank Oscar Lewis, the cultural anthropologist who wrote the book, I believe it was in the early 1960s, called The Culture of Poverty. In his study, and I believe he studied about 7 families living in Spanish Harlem at the time, in his study he found, or he suggested, that the cultural values of poor people is what really kept them in poverty. For one thing, they eschewed hard work and education. They rejected it. They believed that their kids should hustle on the streets to make money for the family, encourage their daughters to have children out of wedlock, to expand the family welfare checks, so forth and so on. So the only thing keeping these people in poverty was their cultural values and their lack of delayed gratification. Most families, he argued, would encourage their kids to go to college, get a degree, and then get a good job. In these families, he found that the families were encouraging the kids to engage in criminal enterprises to make money. Now, keep in mind that you can't extrapolate to the entire population of poor people what happened in a small sample size of 7 families. But nonetheless, Oscar Lewis's study was seized upon by conservatives who wanted to believe that poor people were poor because they just didn't work hard enough and they were lazy and they encouraged deviance in their children. But Oscar Lewis's study was summarily dismissed by William Julius Wilson, the Harvard sociologist who wrote a book called The Truly Disadvantaged, which looked at structural systems in place and the history of racism and discrimination in our country that accounted for blacks and other people of color, brown and black people, being disproportionately represented among the poor. For instance, among African Americans, historically there were laws in place, de jure discrimination or segregation, where state, local, and federal governments formatted legislation that segregated African Americans into ghetto communities, redlined their neighborhoods where they couldn't buy homes. And buying a house was a way to earn wealth for middle-class families. It determined what school your child went to, the schools your child went to. You earned equity, which gave you income. And also, if that house was owned by you, then when you died, you could pass that down as an inheritance to your children. But African Americans were deprived of that because for so many years they weren't allowed to buy homes because of segregation or discriminatory policies by our government. So Oscar Lewis's book revealed those things. Now, the term urban underclass defines family and individuals in the inner city that represent the very bottom of the economic hierarchy. But unfortunately, we only see poor people as black and brown thanks to media and I guess our systems of entertainment that constantly show the poor as being black and brown. But there's a lot of poverty in white rural areas in Western Ohio, in Tennessee, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and territories they call Appalachia. But those aren't the people we see represented in poverty. So when we see the poor as being black and brown, and we live in a country which unfortunately maintains racist ideas about people of color, we get this idea that poor people are black and brown, undeserving people who should not get help from the government, but instead should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. We'll get a little bit more into that when we talk about race in a couple of weeks. Now, a final point is that a significant number of poor people work, but yet they remain poor. So we should stop telling people to just get a job because they're already working and yet they still remain poor. Well, that concludes the lecture. Now you can take your quiz. The quiz, like we have in class, has 5 questions. Each question is worth 1 point, and you will take that online on D2L. Next week, we will talk about gender stratification. I don't think our classes will be meeting face to face for some time now, and it is quite conceivable that we will spend the entire semester from this point on online. But regularly check your email because we'll be giving you updates that way. In the meantime, stay safe, wash your hands, practice social distancing as much as possible so that we don't spread coronavirus. And I really hope and pray that we get back to normalcy and that all of us stay safe and that we don't get sick with corona. But until then, we have to do our part and try to limit the spread of the virus. Everybody take care, and I'll see you online next week.